like, why'd you put that table there if you didn't want me to jump on it?
It's a good question. All right, we'll just chill for a few minutes, let everyone in. I guess Gabriel is not here yet, but Yvonne, we already told Verne, but just under the chat, when you send messages, it's just automatically put to panelists only. So yeah, if you could just make sure it's panelists and attendees.
Sure, no problem.
Thanks. We had some problems last time.
Sure. And I see Gabe has joined.
Oh, okay. All right.
Hi all, as mentioned on the registration page, we'll be recording this panel to share on our website later, so we'll start that now. Welcome everyone, thanks for coming. I'll take the opportunity to tell you, I believe that we have the option to turn on closed captioning if you want that. All right, let's get to it. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are today. I'm Luz Villarreal, and I'm happy to welcome everyone to ACA UBC's second panel in our discussion series, Documenting Injustice as it Unfolds. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of British Columbia is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. There will be a link in the chat. Many of our ACA at UBC execs are also located in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Since this is a remote panel, many of our audience members and panelists are in different parts of the world, and we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all likely living, working, and having these conversations about the documentation of injustice on stolen land. I'd like to invite our audience members to reflect on injustices faced by First Nations and Indigenous peoples of North America and beyond, and to familiarize yourself, if you haven't had the opportunity, with the land you live and work on. We provided a link to nativeland.ca in the chat for anyone interested in learning more about that. With today's discussion topic in mind, I'd also like to take this time to provide some information about the ongoing crisis in Indigenous communities and in Canada of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls by including a link to the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women in the chat. First Nations and Indigenous peoples have experienced and fought against discrimination, hate crimes, and other acts of injustice, and we'd like to take this moment to acknowledge and extend our support to the First Nations and Indigenous groups fighting against injustices against Native women and girls. Now I'll hand it off to Natalie and Sarah, our wonderful co-coordinators, to start us off.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for coming. My name is Natalie Chapisano, and I am one of the now outgoing co-coordinators of the ACA UBC. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. My name is Sarah Ainsworth, and I am the other outgoing co-coordinator of the ACA at UBC.
So just running through our agenda here, just want to start out and just thank again everyone for being here, and thank you to the ACA professional chapter for helping us organize these, and thank you for all of the ACA at UBC student execs that have hung in here throughout the past year and helped us sort of plan this on a skeleton crew. I know it's been a hard year and you guys have all been amazing and we appreciate you. So now this is our second time running a Zoom webinar and hosting a virtual event. But, you know, we've all been living Zoom life for a while now, and, you know, we expect technical glitches, awkward stops and starts, talking over one another, you know, being like, no, you go. So just, you know, let's all be kind to one another, allow for these interruptions. It's all good. Taking it easy today. As for the Q&A versus the chat, just a little disclaimer. If you have comments or want to talk, you can use the chat. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. That way, you can ask things anonymously if you want. You can then, panelists can upvote questions so things can be prioritized. And then we also, in lieu of student pricing for tickets, we just referred people to the Hogan's Alley Society, which is a nonprofit here in Vancouver that advocates for Black Vancouverites who have endured the legacies of urban renewal, forced displacement, and erasure from historical records and historical narrative here in Vancouver. So Hogan's Alley really works toward building the capacity for racialized and marginalized communities to participate in city building. And so, yeah, if you have anything to spare, we know it's hard times, but yeah, we figured that is a good place to funnel your money if you have any to spare. Finally, we have one last panel after this, and it will be on allyship in the archives. We will post a link to our chat in case you haven't heard about that or had a chance to get registered yet. And with that, we will be passing it back to Luce to begin questions and introductions.
Thanks, Natalie. Okay, so I suppose we'll get this started. I'd like to take this moment to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and any sort of pertinent information they'd like to give out before the panel officially starts with questions. So maybe Verne would like to go first.
Thank you. Greetings, everybody. Thank you to the chapter, especially to Natalie, Sarah, and Felicity. Really appreciate all the hard work you've put into making this happen. In terms of introducing myself, I think, let me just say that I'm a descendant of Norwegian and British settlers living on land here in Johannesburg, which before colonization was inhabited by San, Sotho, and Tswana peoples and polities. I live on stolen land, and I am a beneficiary of colonization and apartheid. I think of myself as a memory worker. I come out of a very specific South African context, and I've been profoundly shaped by the tradition we call here, which emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, of memory for justice. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Verne. Okay, let's see. Yvonne, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Especially thank you to Natalie and Sarah and also Luz for organizing this. So I'm calling in from Prague in the Czech Republic, although I am actually Canadian and grew up in Toronto. So I manage the archives program at Witness, and Witness is an international human rights organization that supports activists who are using video and technology to document human rights abuses. So we do this we have programs in different regions around the world where we work with local organizations and communities. So for example, right now, some of our current work involves supporting indigenous communities in the Amazon who are using video to document illegal resource extraction from their lands. We're working with cop watch organizations in the United States who are documenting police misconduct in their communities. We're working with activists and journalists in the Middle East who are documenting war crimes that are ongoing. So my role at Witness is to support all of our projects where they concern archiving in the broad kind of sense. So any kind of collection, media management, preservation, anything that relates to supporting activists to use their video collections most effectively in their advocacy work.
All right, and Gabe, if you would finish us up with introductions.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. As I said before we got started, it's an honor to be on the panel with Yvonne and Verne. So thank you again. And I am calling in from Austin, Texas. This is the land of the Humano and Sana peoples. My family has actually been in this area a little bit south of here in this part of central South Texas, since it was part of northern Mexico before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. I run the Texas After Violence Project. Actually, I'm part of a team of amazing people who run the project. And we essentially are a documentary and community archive that works around state violence. So we've done community-based documentation and archival projects on police violence, in custody deaths, mass incarceration, the death penalty. Most recently, when we recognized that COVID was going to become a crisis in jails and prisons in the US, that leaders and administrators weren't going to do anything in the early days of the pandemic to save lives of not only people who are incarcerated, but also staff at jails and prisons, we quickly put together a project that we call Sheltering Justice, which is a documentation and archival project about COVID and mass incarceration in the US. We are slightly expanding that work to also look at what some people have referred to, like the twin pandemics happening between racial justice movements against white supremacy, particularly after George Floyd and the uprisings that we saw in the summer of last year. So we're looking broadly at this idea of sheltering justice. So much more to say about our work, but I'll stop there and just again to say thank you for the invitation.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for your introductions. I suppose we'll jump into the first question. What motivated you to do this type of work? Was there a specific event or opportunity that got you started? Anyone can begin.
I suppose we can just go around in circles here. So let me jump in. I want to link that first question to the second question, if you don't mind, because they're so closely related. It's hard to talk about origins with any certainty, right? How did I come into this work? But for me, I think it began when at the age of 17, I was conscripted into the apartheid military. And I came out of that 2 years later, shattered at many levels and clear about only one thing, is that I needed to study history to understand what was happening in my country. I studied history at university, and that's where I discovered archives. And I became an archivist, but outside of that workspace, because of what I was learning about the country and learning about my own journey and responsibility in relation to that history, I became active in anti-apartheid structures. And in those structures, I came to understand that memory in the context of apartheid South Africa was a powerful instrument of struggle. In contexts where people are being silenced, where people are being banned, where people are being detained, murdered. To hold memory, to tell stories, and to find ways to make that memory a resource for struggles, for justice, was what I learned. And you take a structure like a detainee support group. What we were doing in that support work was very much about keeping memories and voices alive. And I can't remember now how long it took for me to connect what I was doing in anti-apartheid structures on the one hand, and what I was doing in my paid archival work. But when I made that connection, I realized that actually I was doing archival work in society. And in that conventional archival space, the call of justice was very powerful. So two streams which came together for me. I think that answers the first two questions in a provisional way. Thank you.
If the other two panelists would also like to address question two, I'll also say it now here. Did you start as an archivist who came into social justice work, or as an activist who uses records and archives to work towards justice? How do you think that has affected your perspective and relationship with archival theory and our practice? Please feel free to incorporate these questions into another.
Yvonne, is it okay if I go? Okay. I actually worked with Texas After Violence many, many years ago as an undergraduate, as an unpaid undergraduate intern. It was a new organization at that time. They were just starting and I came in to help. And at that time, we were traveling around the state of Texas doing oral histories with both the families of murder victims and the families of people who'd been executed. And we were doing, sort of long form oral history work with our little camera and sitting in people's living rooms and really bearing witness to all that they had experienced with the loss of a loved one, the interactions with the criminal legal system, and for people who aren't familiar with the death penalty in Texas, one, it's very active. But two, it's a long process, typically 15 to 20 years between a death sentence and when an execution is carried out because of the many layers of appeals. And that work, I was young, I was in my early 20s, and it completely destroyed me. Because again, when you're sitting 3 feet away from somebody who's grieving, and opening their lives to you in the form of story and narrative, as a human, we can't help but bring that suffering into ourselves. I think socially, biologically, psychically, there's a lot of processes happening that make that impact so devastating to hear these stories and to bear witness to these stories of suffering. And in a very simple way, that experience of my own direct trauma, I mean, people would call that secondary trauma. We think it's more of a direct form of trauma from the stories. My total transformation of my outlook, my understanding of the world around me, in a simple way, made me recognize the importance of this work, the potential, the transformative potential of documenting people's experiences with violence and trauma and survival with empathy, with compassion, with understanding, non-judgmentally, basically trying to create space for them to do that. And so in the years, and then I came back to TAVP several years later, in the years in between, I took that recognition and that understanding of the power of stories and narrative with me and applied it in different contexts, even working on death penalty cases, on appeals as an investigator, as a mitigation investigator, where you go into somebody's community, someone who's been given a death sentence, and you build relationships of trust, you listen deeply to their stories, and you essentially tell the story to the judge as part of the appeal that the jury at the trial didn't hear. So to the second question, I'll just say, I'm actually not a professional credentialed archivist, although I see myself as an archivist, community archives person. I love everything about archives. I love everything about community memory work. I'm obsessed with it. And I'm, happy to devote my life to this. So I came to it very much recognizing that the archival piece of our work at TAVP is just one step in a long process of what we're trying to achieve, which is big cultural change around how we think about and address violence in our communities in ways that don't perpetuate more violence and trauma, like tidal waves sort of rippling out into the community, both, vertically and horizontally, like we say, horizontally across families and communities, vertically across generations. So so I come to the work very much as a appreciator and lover of archives. And I should also say we do have a professional archivist on staff, because those skills are good for us to have on our team. So I just like to pretend and also just like to talk and think about archival practice and theory. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Gabe. That was really interesting to hear that background. So yeah, I think, you know, I had prior experience in my personal life with activism and community involvement, but I would say that I definitely was introduced to the sort of human rights framework and international human rights as an archivist through my role at Witness. I've been at Witness since 2009. And at that time, I was primarily responsible for, Witness's own collection of videos that we had been collecting since the 1990s. And I think 2011 was a really pivotal year with the Arab Spring and the beginnings of the Syrian civil war. And we were working with a number of citizen journalists and documentation groups at that time. And as you all probably know, there was this huge amount of video documenting these crimes being just uploaded to social media. And like, it's the Syrian civil war is sometimes called the YouTube war, because there were millions of videos uploaded. And so we started getting a lot of questions and training requests around archiving. So like, how do you handle these like mass amounts of video evidence that are being shared by civilians, ordinary people, and being posted to social media? Around that time, we're part of a global network called the Video for Change network. And around that time, we also had a global convening in Yogyakarta. And it was identified as a sort of global need for accessible grassroots archiving resources for how people can do archiving with sort of low, without a ton of resources. So that was a sort of beginning of the shift in what I was working on, from managing Witness's own archives to sort of what I do a lot more now in terms of like the training and support with our partners, developing resources, rather than focusing on our own collection. In terms of just how I kind of came into this world, I guess you could say that I have some formal archives training, although it's not a sort of traditional archives program. So I went through the Moving Image Archiving and Preservation program at NYU, which is focused specifically on audiovisual archiving, and also based in a performing arts school, film school, rather than in a library science, as part of a library science program. And sort of similar to Gabe, I've never worked in a traditional collecting institution. I've never worked in a traditional archives besides like some internships and work study jobs. And I've always been involved in community archiving projects like Transfer Collective or the Community Archiving Workshop. And I think that my sort of somewhat traditional, but not entirely traditional sort of archives background has served me well, because I think, archival theories and practices have a lot of application outside of traditional collecting institutions. And most often in the work that I do now, I serve this kind of intermediary interpreter role. So kind of interpreting like traditional archives, theories and practices to different types of audiences of non-archives and non-traditional archive contexts. So like working with like lawyers or activists and journalists and all these different types of audiences who have a need for this kind of these kinds of resources, but not in a traditional archive sense.
All right, thank you all for answering that question, those two questions very well. On to the next. what legal and ethical concerns should we be aware of when documenting, preserving, and providing access to evidence of injustices, violence, human rights violations, etc.? We'd like to do a round robin again, starting with Verne.
So I was hoping someone else would jump in first. Yeah, this is such a huge question, right? So let me say just a couple of things. Firstly, for me, the call of justice in this space doesn't allow you ever to simply document, record. It calls you to support, to be part of. And when you are part of struggles for justice, you enter what is frequently a murky ethical space. And arguably, in most contexts, you will have to break the law at some point. So that having a moral compass becomes absolutely fundamental. And I don't want to punt a particular moral compass for myself. I find that in what I call deconstructive intersectionality that gives me a frame, a reference. Last thing I would say is, in addition to that moral compass, in this work you need comrades, compañeros, people you work with, you consult with, people who can keep you honest, people who you choose to be accountable to. I'll stop there. Thanks.
As Verne said, this is a huge question. I mean, there could be a dozen panels at least about this specific question. Something that we at Texas After Violence think actually a lot about, just because I think, especially when doing memory work around state violence, the risks are amplified in a lot of ways. And I'm very open and try to be very open and honest about the mistakes we've made in the past and how we've evolved in our protocols and our practices to learn from those mistakes. And frankly, by learning from other people and other groups in the US and elsewhere, doing similar work and saying, this is a model that we ought to integrate because it seems like it can push us forward ethically and to do our work ethically and responsibly. I think there are multiple levels to address this question. I think on one level, one way that we've been evolving as an organization is just recognizing that it's always best when we can have the people in our community. So in other words, people who are directly impacted by state violence, whether it's police violence or mass incarceration, the death penalty, not just being people we're documenting in terms of storytellers or record creators, contributors of materials to the archives, but actually helping lead the project at all stages. And that's something we're getting better at, is recognizing that need and then bringing our community into the process from the beginning. And we're thinking about ways to do that, not just on a project basis, but actually organizationally too. So it's really shifting the model and really embracing a participatory approach to our memory work. And then I think on another level, there's just really trying to think hard about all the risks that are involved with a specific project that we are undertaking, and then really trying to think hard about how we can mitigate those risks. I mean, very concretely. So, I talk often about the double-edged sword of evidence creation with this kind of documentation work. We often talk about the need to create evidence of human rights abuses, but on the other side of that is the inadvertent creation of evidence that can harm the people that we're working with, and something that we think a lot about. It's why, for example, for many years, we never did interviewing around active death penalty cases, because we didn't want to create evidence that could be harmful to somebody's appeal. And, not underestimating the likelihood of a prosecutor wanting to get their hands on one of our oral histories and actually using those materials as a way to undermine an appeal for an execution. And so many other, many examples of the ways that we can, despite our best intentions, actually create harm for the people that we're working with. So that's one example that I think is one that we should think about more, that I often work with a lot of other groups that want to do this kind of work. And that's kind of those concrete sort of risks are the ones that I tend to go to first, because they seem to be the most urgent and potentially the most damaging. And so I try to just encourage people to really slow down and think through some of those issues before any recorder or camera goes on. So much more to say about this, but I'll pass it off to Yvonne.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. I agree. This is a huge topic. I think what Verne, the way that Verne, you kind of framed the thinking about this in terms of in solidarity and support, really resonated with me. And also Gabe, in terms of like learning from one's own mistakes, also resonated a lot with me. In relation to this idea of solidarity, I think it's important to consider, what one's motivation is for undertaking something like a project like archiving and documentation, and sort of being kind of critical about one's own suitability. And why are you or your institution involved in the documenting, preserving, or providing access, and being really clear with anybody that you're collaborating with, any communities that you're working with, about what your motivations are, and being really transparent about that. And thinking about, are you the best situated to do this work, or as Verne said, is there somebody else who's doing it that you could be supporting in a different way instead? So somebody who has more proximity to or understanding of the thing that's being documenting, who wants to be doing this archiving and documentation work, but just needs some support. And when you're playing that support role, really listening and understanding, what the community that you're trying to support, what their needs and goals are, and helping them achieve their goals, and providing help where it's needed. I think one thing that's important to note is to be really careful about what commitments you're making, being realistic about what your capacity is and what you're promising in terms of, security and access, how information will be used, your ability to sustain the preservation. It can be really harmful to overcommit or to create false expectations about what you're able to deliver. And as Gabe mentioned, really important to keep in mind consequences, like potentially unintended consequences. For one example, could be, I've heard of a situation where, people being interviewed, multiple times about, traumatic things that have happened to them. And in fact, the existence of there being multiple interviews actually being damaging to their case, because many people were trying to collect these stories. And I think understanding what unintended consequences might be, understanding what that risk is, comes from having that familiarity and having that relationship with the situation and with the communities who are doing this. So it kind of goes back to that question about like, why are you doing this, and are you the best situated to undertake this work?
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, which is somewhat related, I think. When you see work in this area in archives and/or cultural institutions, what are you most wary of, which is sort of what we've touched on, but what also excites you when you see work in this area?
Yeah, all of these questions are so rich. So a lot one could say. In terms of what am I most wary of, I think I would name two things. And again, I'm speaking to you at a particular point in my life journey. It's speaking for others rather than amplifying their voices. In other words, that trap of taking on a savior role. I'm also wary of the extent to which this kind of work easily takes over your life. Now, I find it really interesting. I see people in corporate environments where they stop having a life, and it's really in the pursuit of power and income and so on. But in the social justice space, I find very often activists lose that sense of having a life. And the work that they do takes over their life. It's really hard being a life partner to someone in that space. In terms of what excites me the most now is the belief and the evidence that one is contributing to making a difference in the world. And that means more and more to me as I get older and as I see the world in spaces that feel almost hopeless. But you do this work and you encounter people doing the most extraordinary things, and it's inspiring. And the other exciting thing is the extent to which in this work you learn about yourself. You think you know yourself, but there's always something new to learn and to grow. Thank
I agree with everything Verne just said. No surprise there. Particularly what he said about the savior role, sort of the trap of the savior role, I think resonated because that's kind of what I was trying to get at in the last question about why, as an organization, even though we're a very small organization, we do a ton of work. And I'm very proud of all that we're able to do as a very small organization. But that's kind of what I was talking about when I'm recognizing increasingly that we sometimes just have to get out of the way and let the people with direct lived experience who are experts in their own, because of their own lived experience, take the lead. And we can support them. And this gets back to what Yvonne was just saying about supporting the needs of your community, the communities that you work with. I mean, this, to me, I see TAVP as playing that support role increasingly. And one example that we're working on right now that I'm really excited about is we've put together a small group that's representative of our community, of both memory workers who are interested in social justice and liberation, and also people who are formerly incarcerated or who've lost a loved one to state violence. We put them in a small group, and we're working with a design justice firm called And Also Too to come in and facilitate co-design sessions so that we can learn from our community what resources would be most useful to them based on our archival collection. So instead of us saying, let's create XYZ, actually working with a design justice group to come in and facilitate co-design sessions to say, this is what would be most useful for these objectives that we're interested in. So, examples are like promoting transformative justice, decarceration, prison abolition, supporting people in healing from the trauma that they've experienced as a result of state violence. So this is the beginning for us. We're moving in that direction, and I hope to do that increasingly in the years to come. What I'm excited about right now, well, one, generally, I'm excited to be doing this work at all. I can't believe that I get to wake up and this is, what I get to do every day. I genuinely believe in the power of community archives and archives generally to change the world. I genuinely believe that. And not just, the preservation aspect is important, the accessibility access is important, but the activation part is crucial in the ways that we can collaborate with organizers, activists, writers, artists, and other memory workers to really do amazing things. And I'm constantly seeing others doing some of this amazing work. I was just coming from a panel at the Archiving the Black Web. Yvonne, you were just at that panel too. Archiving the Black Web virtual conference that's going on yesterday and today. And I'm just, furiously taking notes because I'm so inspired by what other people are doing and getting ideas for TAVP and how we can adapt our work too. So, the other thing I would just want to say, what excites me is it seems like there's increasing recognition, and this is not an accident. This is because of the hard work of people like Burgess Jules who've been advocating to get resources to community archives. So it seems like that's happening. It seems like resources are finally starting to flow to community-based archival work. I'll just on that note, I'll just say, just because funders and other institutions are recognizing this importance of this work now doesn't mean that it's new. Communities have been marginalized and oppressed communities have been doing memory work forever, forever. And they may not call it community archives, but that's what they've been doing. So that's the point that I always try to make too, because I think sometimes that gets lost in conversations around the trajectory of the field and sort of the interests and the intersections of social justice and memory work. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Yvonne.
Thanks. I would totally echo Verne and Gabe on this sort of the trap of this sort of savior complex, the potential for exploitation. And I think that the danger with is that it's not happening out of malice, right? It happens unconsciously. And I think it's very easy for people to get very caught up or focused on, certain particular goals, to be very immersed in a certain perspective, or to be, responding from pressures coming from one direction that they miss, seeing who else might be harmed or impacted, or who else, should be part of a conversation. So I think it is, really unconscious a lot of the time. And so, I've learned from my own failures and experience that, it can be really easy to reproduce the existing power dynamics because that's the default, and that's what will happen if you don't approach, your work with a lot of intention. Just because that's the default. In terms of what excites me, Gabe, I was I was going to refer to this panel that we were literally just listening in on before we joined this one. It was like phenomenal. There were speakers from Don't Shoot Portland and from dissenters.org talking about how they were training activists while in the middle of a protest on how they they could be documenting, police badges and police misconduct more effectively, then using that documentation in their fight at City Hall, and get victories using that documentation. And then, also going back into the Portland's own historic city archives to connect the work that they're doing now with, a longer history of activism in the city. I was completely just, reinvigorated and inspired from that panel, and hearing how people are creating archives and using archives. It was amazing.
Yeah, that really does sound very exciting. Move on to the next question. Are there individuals or organizations which have been instrumental to your work? If so, which ones, and how did they support you?
That's an impossible question to answer. I mean, the work I've done over decades has changed so much over time, so many different partners, but maybe just take one example of a project that we're busy with right now. We did an analysis on patterns of intergenerational transfer of inequality, poverty in South Africa. And we identified as one of the potential game changers to disturb those patterns. Early childhood development. Too many of our youngsters by the age of 6 are almost lost to the system, right? And most of our youngsters are not in early childhood development centers. They're actually in detention centers. They're not being given educational opportunities. We did the analysis and we discovered that at root, it was an archival problem because government only had a database of about 20,000 early childhood development centers, creches, and so on in the country. And we then did the research and we generated partnerships which enabled us to now document 60,000. And that database is now the property of government, but it's been generated with money from foreign donors, the private sector. We've worked closely with community-based organizations. And we're now moving into a second phase, which is about enabling these now registered centers to go through the laborious process of qualifying for government subsidies. And part of the challenge is that so many of these practitioners in communities don't have the resources they need to create the archive they need, information on the parents. I mean, government requires information like, well, for each parent who has a child in that center, how much does that parent earn? And so on and so on. And so now we're in a phase of capacitation workshops for practitioners, fundamentally an archival project that. So I'm giving you one example of the kinds of partnerships which work in this space, and increasingly in the South African context, it's becoming evident that we have to find ways, especially in spaces where the state is failing, is to work across sectors and to find ways of drawing even individual government officials into these justice processes and building capacity within those structures of the state. It's almost like a kind of a fungal strategy. Thanks.
I'm going to name some names because I want the participants to follow these folks, to look them up and follow these folks. But I will say, interestingly, like several years ago, I dipped a toe into an archival program, archives master's program. I took one class. And Verne, your work was all over that syllabus, and it was formative for me. It really was, as a way to to situate what TAVP was doing and trying to do within a broader context around liberatory memory work. So I thank you for that, and I'm glad I took that class. There are others, though, that we go back to TAVP, and me and my colleagues go back to over and over again for inspiration and for guidance over and over again. And so this list is not exhaustive by any means, but I do want to just name some of these individuals because, again, I want the people on the call, if you don't already know them, to look them up and look up their work. So just a couple of folks off the top of my head: scholars like Michelle Caswell, people who are working in other contexts outside of the academic institutions, like Youssef Amwale at Southern California Library. Jarrett Drake is a close friend of TAVP's, and we get a lot of guidance and inspiration from him. I already mentioned Burgess Jules, Zakiya Collier, other people working in Black memory work in archives field. And then we already mentioned, Yvonne mentioned Don't Shoot Portland. Representatives were on the panel right before this. And I always learn something when they're speaking about their work, and always I'm learning about ways that TAVP can push our work forward. So again, that list is not exhaustive, but I just wanted to mention it. So if you don't already know those names, to look them up, because there's someone who I and who my colleagues regularly go back to for inspiration and guidance.
Yeah, I would second all of those people that Gabe mentioned. As Verne said, there's there's so many people to name that I almost don't want to name all the specific people for, in case I leave anybody out, but, of course, all of, the partners and my colleagues that I work with, day to day on these multi-year kind of projects are continually inspiring me. One thing I did want to bring up, just as an archivist, how important it has been for me to have amazing bosses and mentors throughout my career as an archivist, and what a difference that has made. So, bosses like Grace Lyle and Deirdre Logue just have, made my whole career possible. I think it's really important, and it's you're lucky if it is a situation that you get to be in. I also just the archival community I've found has always been very supportive, whether that's professional and, certain, communities within professional associations, or, networks like Documenting the Now that Gabe is also part of, that's organized by people like Burgess Jules, who we mentioned. Yeah.
All right, thank you for all those resources that you've provided to us, Gabe and Yvonne. As a part two to this question, what qualities do you believe are key to successful partnerships and other collaborative efforts?
I'm thinking of some of these names, and yes, Jarrett and Michelle. What are the qualities? I think, again, one could say so much, but shared vision, shared values, shared passion, I think.
I think, we tend to not have any problems when we're partnering with community activist organizations. Depending on the project, we've had some really excellent collaborations. One was, one project that stands out because I think it was successful. It was a successful collaboration, was when we partnered with Texas Advocates for Justice, which is a group led by formerly incarcerated people and their families. And we did documentation and archival project with them, where we trained them in our sort of oral history methods, and they did all the oral history themselves. They ran the audio and video equipment themselves. You know, it was just a really cool collaborative effort there. I think we're still trying to figure out how to navigate some partnerships with institutions, with academic institutions. I think, you know, some that we've had have been more successful than others. I think sometimes, and that's for a lot of reasons, but I do think that there, you know, something I often say is that Texas After Violence Project, we're independent nonprofit. We fight for every dollar that we bring in for grants, for donations. We are not guaranteed to be around forever. We really work hard to bring in the funding to keep our work going. It's a very real possibility that we cannot exist in 2 years or 3 years. And so I do think that in some ways, well, two things. One, that's why sustainability is so important for these community archival efforts. But secondly, sometimes that institutional partnership is necessary to make sure that the collection lives on, is preserved beyond the life of the organization. And so I'm interested in models where this has been successful and where it's more as equitable as it possibly can be. Doesn't necessarily have to be an academic institution, but a bigger organization or institution with some staying power, where a small group like ours, you know, I hope TAVP is around forever. That's part of my job description, is to make sure that happens. But, you know, very real possibility that, you know, funders will move on from this interest in community archives one day. And then what happens? So, on a sort of very practical level, I think that's also why a lot of the work that the Architecting Sustainable Futures Symposium in 2017, I think in New Orleans, which was organized by Shift and people like Burgess, who we've already mentioned, is so important, because it was trying to have real concrete conversations about sustainable funding models for community archives. So I think that's something that we have to be honest about in terms of the sustainability of doing this work for the long term.
Yeah, I think for me, the key to successful partnerships really just boils down to trust. And so that's whether you're working with, you know, organization partners much larger than you, or organizations smaller than you as well. And, you know, it just comes down to spending the time, being consistent and reliable, you know, doing what you say you're going to do, being understanding and accepting of where everyone is at, and being transparent and open about that. And that's how that relationship of trust develops just over time and from showing up.
All right, thank you all for answering that question so well. We have a question in the question and answer section that I'd like to ask. I've sort of been sitting on and I wanted to insert it at the right place. For anyone, what is the role that language has had in or on your work? Has your background influenced the way you go about description or redescription of your archives work? From Bree or Bri, perhaps. This is available in the question and answer section if you want to view it.
Gabriel, Yvonne, I'm not going first on this one.
I'll take a stab at it, but it'll be sort of a half-formed thought. I mean, so at Witness, we work in multiple languages, but I would say definitely English is our dominant working language. Like all of our meetings are in English, and I'm a native English speaker. So, often I think historically, when we've created resources, we've often created them in English and then translated them to other languages. And I think we're trying to sort of trying to decentralize that more now. you know, so that, you know, it's not all being done in English first. You know, in terms of, like, I don't do a lot of like description and that kind of stuff these days, in terms of like cataloging. But, you know, I have worked on projects where that involve cataloging and not in English also. And in terms of developing those schemas or those descriptive models, it's been really essential that those models have been developed collaboratively, and not just like applying some kind of descriptive standard to a situation where it doesn't fit. You know, certainly, you know, drawing from standards can be helpful because people have thought of, you know, something a lot. It can be helpful to adapt what's already been done. But I think it's really important to, you know, when creating any kind of descriptive kind of model, to do it in a way that suits the particular situation.
Yeah, same, you know, this is an area where we are improving as an organization. And finally, as we're bringing in resources to develop the archival collection, we can then finally do things that we've been wanting to do for a long time, like translating. We're currently translating metadata into Spanish, and working and wanting to do more work around descriptions of our materials in a way that's more equitable and ethical and in line with the needs of our community. And so that is an area where we're actually doing work now. Even just this week as a team, we've been discussing what we can do around accessibility, increasing accessibility, not only to our materials, but to any content that we generate, resources, trainings, whatever the case may be. And so I've been inspired by other people in the archives world who recognize the importance of language justice. I'm thinking of my friend TK Singwan, who I know has done a lot of work around this. She's at UCLA, has done a lot of work around this. And so again, this is one area where we need the resources to do this, but that's not an excuse. I mean, it's not having the resources is not an excuse to prioritize and centralize issues around access and language. So very important question. Thank you for asking it.
Great answers from Gabriel and Yvonne. I don't know that I have much to add to that, except to say that in a South African context, the dominance of English is fundamental to a resilient white supremacy in the country. And it's in the last year that at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we've looked in the mirror on that. The extent to which we use English as the language of work is problematic. And we've just started language classes for all our staff to ensure a multilingualism in the workspace.
Sorry, Verne, I actually have a question. I have the understanding that South Africa has a number of official languages.
Yes, we have 11 official languages. And I remember I was working in government for those first 5-6 years after 1994. And, you know, we worked hard to ensure that every publication was in multiple languages. The first stages of ensuring that the archival work, the finding aids and so on, the reading room services were embracing that principle of multilingualism. We started well, but very quickly English became, you know, the language in the office. I mean, Black colleagues, I remember Silwa Tang once saying to me, you know, the extent to which I have to leave my Blackness at the front door. And this is even in context, well, take the Nelson Mandela Foundation. We have 37 people. Only 2 of us are white, and yet English is the language of our meetings. If you look on our website, if you look at our finding aids, it's something that we're owning now. But it's far too slow, far too slow.
I mean, I'll just add on a personal note, I mentioned that I live in the Czech Republic, and just the fact that I've managed to somehow live in a country that is not English speaking for 5 years and barely learn the language, despite my initial intentions to learn it, the fact that it's easy enough for me to get by only speaking English, just I think speaks to that sort of like the privilege that native English speakers enjoy everywhere.
Sorry.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, I got it. Let's go back to some of the regularly scheduled questions. There are some questions that are coming up in the Q&A if the panelists would like to review before I jump some of those on them. But returning to the scripted questions, what does justice, either through the archives or through other channels, look like for you and the community that you serve?
Verne, you want me to go first on this one? Okay, let's give Verne a break. He had to answer those first questions with no time to prepare. So this is a really great question. And, it's interesting because when we do these interviews with survivors of violence and state violence, we try to be, we sort of, what we've taken from the oral history tradition was to, like I said before, open space for people to retell the stories of their lives in their own way. And so we don't tend to ask a lot of questions, or try not to. And we sort of just want to participate in the dialogue instead of a sort of Q&A type interview. However, one question that we have been trying to bring in more when there's the opportunity is, what does justice look like for you? Again, these are people whose loved ones have been killed by the police, or have experienced long-term incarceration themselves, or lost a loved one to a violent crime, like murder. And so I think the question really ought to be put to them. What I can say, though, here is, increasingly for me and for the organization, and I can speak for my colleagues here, is really trying to figure out how we can contribute to building transformative justice. And not just saying it, because I think it's easy to just say, we believe in transformative justice, or we believe in prison abolition, or we believe whatever. It's easy to say it. And I think, what we're interested in is really on a granular, concrete level, trying to see how our little organization can actually contribute to these broader movements. And again, really embracing this idea of addressing harm and violence in ways that don't perpetrate more harm and violence. It's as simple as that. And really trying to think through not only what that vision is for us and how we learn it from others in our, that we are inspired by, who've been doing this organizing work for a really long time, but also, again, really trying to think about how our work, as limited as it might be, because we're we're a small organization and we can only do so much, but really how we can contribute to those broader movements.
I can go next, so Verne can go last for once. Yeah, I agree with everything that Gabe has said. It goes without saying probably that obviously justice is much more than retributive justice and punishment, like all of these types of justice that Gabe has mentioned. in terms of like, actually righting the wrongs and making sure that these things don't continue to happen, recognition and apology for what has happened, reparations, compensation, and memorialization of the past wrongs. And as Gabe also mentioned, I think archives can play an important role in that, but it has to be part of something like, it has to be part of a process of like organizing, advocacy. There has to be the political will, a lot of other things.
I think it would be accurate to say that the communities that we serve, when I say we, Nelson Mandela Foundation, for these communities, what justice looks like is redistribution. Give the land back. And perhaps disturbingly, for these communities, justice doesn't look like democracy. It doesn't look like international human rights discourses, because democracy is failing too many people. And I think the challenge then within a justice frame, and it's a scary challenge, is to begin to think beyond democracy. And I think in your answers, both you, Gabriel, and Yvonne, I think you kind of suggesting that we have to find other ways of imagining what a transformed society would look like. For me, I still draw heavily on Frantz Fanon, justice as a standing responsible before the wretched of the earth and acting with them to transform the world. Thank you.
Thank you for your answers. Moving on, what considerations should non-community members take into account when they're working as allies and co-organizers to document community struggles / experiences? And we've touched a bit on this when it comes to sort of white savior complexes, etc. But if anybody would like to add.
I can take my turn at going first, I guess. Yeah, so going back to what we had talked about in terms of like suitability for taking part in any kind of project. I mean, did somebody in the community, like, were you invited by the community, and do you have ongoing engagement with the community as a non-community member? I mean, I think it's just absolutely essential, like if you're a non-community member, to like really understand the context. One example, this is just something I actually just found randomly the other day, related to British Columbia, is there's a new digital evidence toolkit that the BC Society for Transition Houses just published online. Is really interesting. It's aimed at women and anti-violence workers who are collecting evidence of technology facilitated violence, so that it can be used to support women in BC courts. And in this toolkit, there were a lot of tips that take into consideration the dangers that women might face in archiving or downloading their own content onto devices that say their partners, or if they have abusive partners, might be able to access. And the toolkit also, provides a lot of specifics about what is required to present evidence in a BC court. So to me, that was a really great example of how important it is to really understand the context of where one is working and what the needs of the people who you're working with are. It's really important for not putting somebody in harm's way, giving them archiving advice that doesn't fit the situation, and making sure that, the work is most useful to what they want to do with it. The toolkit is called Digital Evidence Toolkit, published by the BC Society of Transition Houses. I mean, I'm not familiar with the organization. I don't have any connection to the organization. It was something I found online.
I've already kind of hit on some of this already in past questions, so I don't want to repeat any of that. But just to say, to reiterate, recognizing when to get out of the way, and I think is important, but also on the other side of that, recognizing when you have something to offer to help, when you're invited in to do that. And I've been both surprised and not surprised this past year how frequently we at CAVP have been contacted by other groups in other communities and other states across the country wanting to learn how to do this memory work responsibly and ethically. And I hope that we've been able to provide some guidance on that. I've also been having this thought, for months, maybe years, about the need of, and I've talked to other people that we collaborate who've done oral history and documentation, archival work around police violence in the US, about the need for sort of rapid response documentation and archival work in the aftermath of police violence or other forms of state violence, in a way of a sort of immediate narrative intervention. I mean, this is even something that folks on the panel at Archiving the Black Web were talking about, for Don't Shoot Portland, and the importance of that, quickly developing a narrative with activists and community activists and organizers in the aftermath of police violence. It would never make sense for TAVP to try to build that network of rapid response narrative workers, narrative work. But I do hope that we, in collaboration with others, could contribute to offering what we know and learning from the mistakes we've made to other groups that are interested in developing this, because I do think it's critical and increasingly becoming critical when you turn on the news every day, at least in the US, and see horrific reports almost daily of Black and brown people being killed by the police. But, as I said, other forms of state violence too. So I am interested in this question because on the one hand, I'm recognizing the need to stay back and step out of the way, but also wanting to do more and more as a resource for other people in other communities to sort of replicate this type of memory work.
Gabriel, I think you've just put it so beautifully, and it takes us into the next question in terms of role, right? I don't know that I have much to add there, but because I agree completely. I mean, it's that tension of wanting to be responsive, meet needs that are being articulated by communities, networks of people, trade unions, whoever you're working with, but also knowing that you have something to bring, which might be helpful. I think of one example where a trade union had been offered fairly substantial money for an archive, and the discussions immediately were in that conventional space of, okay, so we need an archivist, and then we need a proper storage space, and we're going to process, and we're going to get finding aids and so on. And our input was to say, well, find an institutional partner who will do that for you. Rather use the money to create a resource that's accessible on cheap cell phones that could be really useful to your members on a continuing basis. Last thing I'd say on this one is, and I'm speaking directly to the question, working as allies, as a consideration for me, never call yourself an ally. Let others call you an ally and call you into a role that they determine for you.
That is very excellent advice, I think. I'd like to move ahead a little bit in case some people need to leave at the half-hour mark. So we skip ahead to perhaps one that's gotten a bit more traction, or something that's some people are interested in the Q&A that's related to question 11. How do you practice self-care when working in traumatic or emotionally fraught records? A question from Leah Ray. Could you speak to what effect this work has on you emotionally? I imagine bearing witness to and documenting difficult or challenging stories would have an effect on one's mental health. Do you carry it with you? Does the archivist become the archives?
I can try to start. Yeah, I would say, definitely that is a concern, just in terms of like practical things that, that I do, that I can share. I mean, I definitely limit what I watch. I watch things for purpose. Like I don't, sit all day and just rewatch, traumatic videos, over and over again. Some other techniques that I've heard other people use who do have to watch videos all day, like traumatic videos all day, that to sort of try to minimize some of the harm, is like to turn off the audio, to put some kind of like filter over the image. So like you're viewing it in black and white, or some kind of grid on top of the image so that you create some distance. I've also heard of people like putting Post-it notes over certain parts of the image, so that they don't have to see something, particularly gruesome as they're watching the video. I mean, those are some of the practical tips that I've heard people using. I think it's just also really important to have people to debrief with, and to sort of, talk it out with. I think that is really helpful as well.
I already spoke about some of this in my own experience as a young person getting into this work. No matter what age you are, this can impact you and affect you emotionally. It just so happened that I started as a young person doing this work and was not prepared for that. Now I'm better prepared, because I know the power of the work can have on us emotionally and psychically. And so yes, that's a very important question. In terms of self-care, I mean, I've changed a lot. I've changed a lot of my habits over the years to be able to do this work for the long term. Very, concrete day-to-day things, like I try to run regularly, just to move my body around. The other thing too is getting outside. And I try to work in the sunshine as much as possible at coffee shops, or even I got a little table out here outside my window I'm looking at, right? If it's a nice day, I can work. I think little things like that actually make a big difference. I think organizationally, whether you're at a small nonprofit like me or a big academic institution, is disrupting traditional models of work so that people can really take self-care seriously. So, at TAVP, even though we have a lot of work and it seems like we're always working, we never did the 9 to 5 in an office, and I always said, we're not a business, we're not selling anything, we don't need to be here at 9 o'clock, when the doors open. You can still be accountable to your colleagues and still perform your job at a high level without working yourself into the ground and being expected to be on email all night long. And sometimes there are nights when we're on email late at night because we have things that we're working on, we have a deadline approaching. But I just try to be, as an organization, try to be as flexible as we can to recognize that this is really difficult work to do. And if we're going to be in it in the long term, we really got to take care of ourselves. if we're going to continue to do this work. So I try to practice that as a leader of an organization, and then also try to be non-negotiable about little things like moving my body around on a daily basis, because I can very easily sit at this computer all day very easily. So yeah, and there's a lot of resources on this too, I will say, and especially in the archives world as well. I've seen increasingly people thinking about this question and putting out resources about self-care. So I would highly encourage the participants to look for some of those resources as well.
I'm really tempted just to say amen to Gabriel. Personally, I don't like running so much. I prefer walking, but to get the endorphins flowing, very good. Another one for me is wilderness, species other than human beings, good for the soul. And then a last one, you talk about all these resources. It's extraordinary what's coming out. I was reading a piece this morning, actually, would highly recommend it. It's by Tricia Hersey. I don't know if anyone knows her work, but she makes the argument that rest is a radical act of resistance and decolonization, especially for Black people. And I think that's echoing what you were saying, Gabriel, is creating the empty spaces, just like empty spaces.
Thank you all for the very good tips for our future archivists. Perhaps we could back up a little bit to question 10. To whom or what do we owe our accountability when we are engaging in such work? We have a question from Luciana. Do you think that your work has fostered more transparency and accountability on the part of the government or other public bodies? Or perhaps if you would like to think of this as in terms of community or the public.
We can start here. These are all such excellent deep, excellent questions. I feel like I could take the rest. Speaking of a non-traditional work model, I think I'm gonna take the rest of the day off after this because my brain hurts. But okay, accountability is interesting because I feel like a theme here today is tensions. There's tensions we talked about that Verne mentioned, that I mentioned, and then tensions around ethics and risks of the urge to immediately document injustice versus the risks that it can, and the harm that it can cause. And then here too, and this is just sort of an unformed thought, but I'm thinking of accountability to the people we work with directly: record creators, storytellers, narrators. Accountability to them, yes, of course, but also accountability to these nameless, faceless, people that we may not know, who may not be born yet, and accountability to what we're trying to do with this work and what we're trying to create in our communities, particularly for TAVP, around completely reimagining how we address violence and completely dismantling the criminal punishment system that we've created in the US and completely starting over. And so there's the tension again that I don't know the answer to, but it seems like, because there could be a situation where those two things conflict, those two, the community member who's experienced violence versus the longer term vision, or the mission of the organization, the vision of the organization, or the work of the collective, or whatever, could become in conflict. And I think the question of accountability also becomes very important there, particularly when they might have tension between them. So I think it's got to be, we got to think about it on both and multiple levels of accountability, including, as I said before, not only the present, but the future that we're trying to create. I think is very real and very much an energy and force in why we do this work and how we do this work.
To the question of like whether whether we think our work has fostered more transparency and accountability. I mean, I can point to one project that we published last year that we've been working on for a few years now, is a partnership with Berkeley Cop Watch in California. We worked with them to develop an archive workflow and a database for the documentation that they had been doing for 30 years already, monitoring police in their community in Berkeley, California. And not just the sort of, headline news, egregious like acts of police abuse, but like the everyday harassment that unhoused people and people of color in Berkeley face. And they had, they have video, they go on patrols and they monitor, police on a regular basis. And so, and this is a situation where, you can't, like, records of misconduct are difficult to obtain from the police themselves. The records of that are not available, and they're not, the types of harassment and abuse are, it's not described in a way that resonates with the lived experiences of the people in the community. So, with that database project, Berkeley Cop Watch, has been able to use that database in their advocacy work. So for example, they were able to sort of push for the resignation of a problematic officer in their community because they had accumulated, 30 videos of that officer, harassing people in the community over time with the database. And now they've been doing these really amazing public community events, online events, where they work with somebody who has experienced police abuse, and they have video documentation of the incident, and they bring in members of the community to share that video, to discuss that video, to talk about what the opportunities are for pursuing accountability using that video as evidence. So that's just one example.
Yeah, so maybe to start with that question about transparency and accountability in government, certainly in the South African context, I don't see any evidence of our being successful in that arena. I remember the 1990s and early 2000s as a period of great openness within structures of the state, government, political parties, but that has shifted. And so the struggle for access to information continues. In terms of who we're accountable to, I mean, in the work that we do, obviously we're accountable to donors and other, forms of funder and institutional partners and our board of trustees. Most importantly, I think we're accountable to the beneficiaries of the work that we perform, the communities we work in, right? Is ultimately, if we're making a difference in their lives, and they are telling us that the work that we're doing is helping, is being done in a way that they're comfortable with, then I think in terms of accountability, that's in terms of my scorecard, that's right up there. But at a more philosophical level, I would say that in this kind of work, justice work in archive, accountability, and I loved what you said there, Gabriel, in terms of those who haven't been born yet, right? Because in deconstruction, justice is fundamentally about a responsibility before the ghosts of those who have died, who have been oppressed, who have lost their lives in struggles. Those who are being oppressed now, who are being ghosted by power now, and then the ghosts of those not yet born. I'll stop there. Yeah.
All right, thank you all. We understand that lots of this is quite heavy topics. and we'd like to sort of wrap up our things with our panel with the final question, a few final questions from the audience. Hopefully we can do this without much duress. But we have a question from an anonymous attendee. In the past year, many archives have issued a call for submissions that capture the pandemic. While a variety of records can be part of this, I was kind of disheartened to see that no archives were specifically collecting records that document the increased violence against Asians. So how do non-archivists urge archives that are not specifically designed for capturing these records to document injustice that is being neglected? Feel free to take a moment to think about this question if you need.
I will take a stab at taking a start to answer this question. Gabe and Verne, please feel free. I mean, I think part of the problem is that it's hard to know who is collecting what in the world. So there might very well be people collecting on this issue or other issues, and it's just difficult. There's no sort of way of figuring out who's collecting what a lot of the time. I mean, I think one solution could be for you to archive it yourself. You know, we've published resources on how people or small organizations can, you know, archive what's going on in their own communities. But, you know, again, of course, you have to consider all of those things that we've been talking about throughout this whole couple of hours in terms of security risks and whether, you know, you're the best situated to be doing this. You know, how much you can publicize or reshare the sort of materials that you're collecting if you're not the person who's, you know, that if you're not the person who's documented or if you're not the person who created the documentation. So all of those considerations, I think.
Gabriel, I'm not going to add anything to this.
Yeah, I agree with Yvonne. I would be surprised if there wasn't some community group actually doing, I would be surprised if there wasn't a group actually doing this, like not doing this. I think there probably is, because it has been such a visible and shocking like events these past several months around violence against Asian people in the US. And so I think Yvonne's right that it very well could be happening and we're just maybe not aware of it yet. But I do think that I like I'm drawn to the second part here about urging archives to do it. I think that's an important piece and something that I think hopefully if there are time and resources that archives, community archives or larger archives would be interested to get that urge, to get that nudge, you know, and to hopefully put together a documentation project to focus on that. But as Yvonne said, one that is careful and takes the time to develop it out so that they're not harming people in the process. But yes, I agree that it's something that that I hope somebody or multiple groups are doing. It's very important.
Thanks for answering the impromptu question. We do, in British Columbia, we've also experienced an uptick in Asian hate crimes and violence against Asian populations here. A question specifically for Yvonne: if witness work involves verifying the citizen journalist videos they receive or archives, then what factors in your experience impact the success of the verification process when the videos were not captured by camera or obscura? And which reasons does witness find more difficult to work with?
I would say we're definitely engaged in the conversations around verification. We don't have like a verification program in-house in the same way that like Amnesty has their digital evidence verification core, and various universities. I don't know if UCB is UBC is has that sort of thing, but like, you know, schools like UC Berkeley have work with students to do like kind of verification projects. So we don't do that, but we're definitely engaged in those discussions. And I would say that the impact and success of verification is, you know, we develop a lot of tips for documenters on how they can make their videos more easily verifiable so that it can be more, you know, more effectively used down the line. So basic things like, you know, filming, you know, if safe to do so, like filming landmarks to establish where you are, filming indicators of time and date. I mean, the main things when people are looking to verify is to establish like the provenance. So it's like the time, date, location of where something came from, you know, potentially who filmed it, if that is something that's, you know, safe to record, and then the chain of custody of that video. So where it has gone from the time that it was filmed to the time that it was used, let's say, you know, when we're talking about verification, we're often talking like in a legal context or other type of context.
Thank you, Yvonne. We do have a question from Isabel. Speaking of tensions, what do you see as the primary contradiction dialectically within the work of human rights archiving today between the people and the capitalist state, or something else?
That's
Sorry.
a fantastic question. Primary contradiction. Where I am, here in South Africa, it's feeling like the contradiction between those inside the walls and those outside the walls. The walls get higher and higher. Those inside use private health systems, private schools, private security systems, and those outside have little or nothing. And you know, during COVID, it's played out so kind of vividly where I live. Here in our neighborhood, many of us, you know, we can sit where I'm sitting here and I can work all day long. And I can call in food and I can call in whatever I need. And increasingly in the streets around us are desperate people who are just not being looked after and are hopeless, right? And I think that fundamental contradiction, the haves and the have-nots, is globally. I mean, it's not just a reality here where I live. I think we're seeing it more. These patterns of inequality are deepening, and I think COVID has deepened them dramatically.
You know, one kind of specific tension that we encounter a lot in our work is, you know, just the fact that documenters are so dependent on social media platforms, these privately owned, very highly centralized, huge multinational companies that control the content once it's uploaded, and who have content moderators, often like AI content moderators that will remove graphic content, you know, automatically. That you know, are being used to spread hate speech, and that stuff is not being taken down. So you know, and that's how information is getting, you know, out of places like Myanmar or wherever. And that's how people, and, in places where, investigators or international media can't access, like that is the source of information. And yet it's like on these platforms that are just privately owned and controlled.
Yeah, that's a really great question. My mind, when I was thinking about it, my mind, it's, went to something different than what the question's asking. I'll just quickly just say though that, when I think about our work at TVP and who we do it for, or who we trying to convince, I think that I've struggled with that tension. Whether are we doing this to convince an otherwise apathetic public who don't recognize how their own lives are impacted by policies like mass incarceration or punitive policing or shoot first, ask questions later approaches to policing or whatever? Or are we doing it to generate narrative power within the communities that we work with, and letting that power that's being generated within the communities take power within society? And I don't think it's either or. I think it's both. And that's something that I've been struggling for a long time to think about, and to, again, just trying to recognize where our work at TVP, but then more broadly, memory work around social justice, liberation, dismantling white supremacy, et cetera, where that fits into all of this. So I apologize, Isabel, that's not answering your question, but it is a tension that I think about constantly, and one that I'm like still working through and always looking for guidance to help me navigate this.
Thank you. I think we'll do one final question under the wire. Do the traditional methods and theories of archival appraisal frequently used in government/institutional contexts resonate with you or support the work that you do documenting injustice? I am thinking of the tendency of government/institutional archives to destroy case files, e.g. the recent controversy over ICE, or recordings of police violence that Yvonne mentioned.
So let me take an example of a big project, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I think those traditional, conventional tools were helpful, actually. And I'm thinking of, documentation strategy theory and macro appraisal. Is if you are documenting human rights abuses in apartheid South Africa, and you've got a very limited period of time in which to do it, you have to do that macro analysis. Is what are we looking for? So let's understand the apartheid system. Where will we find the records, the evidence? Which communities were particularly impacted by specific policies, like forced removals, land removals? So where are we going to focus our attention in terms of inviting communities to come and give evidence? Can be useful then, I would say.
I'll just quickly say here that the ease with which government records, particularly of state violence, like I believe you're talking about the destruction of records around abuse of migrant detainees that ICE recommended for the National Archives to destroy, and I think they ultimately did destroy those records. To me, that just goes to the urgency of this work, and trying to document people's experiences around this as a necessary context to some state-generated records. It seems like they have to go hand in hand. You can't just rely on state-generated records around state violence. So, and there's been a lot of examples of this, in terms of records being manipulated or destroyed. So to me, this just goes to the urgency of the work.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to what Verne and Gabe have already said, but yeah, the importance of communities owning and controlling their own records. And, while there's value in, if you can access them, making use of government records, creating one's own records and creating one's own narratives, I think is really important, and telling stories the way that you want to tell them, and not just using, records created and generated by a state that are based on a different narrative.
All right. Thank you all for answering some of those very heavy topics with elegance and grace and insight. Thank you very much. It was wonderful moderating all of you. I will hand it off to Natalie and Sarah to sort of wrap things up. But again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists for being here. We know that you're in different time zones, and we really appreciate your willingness to give us your time and your expertise. And thank you to Luz for moderating. And thank you everyone for joining us. We have one more panel in our discussion series. It's called Allyship in Archives, and we'll drop the link in the chat to the registration page for anyone who wants to join us next month. That's out.
Yeah, so the link, I just posted the link in the chat for our last panel for anyone who would like to show up for that one on May 28th, same time. Brian has dropped a feedback form in the chat. We'll also be sending that out to emails of registrants, so you don't have to do it now, but it's there if you want it fresh on the brain. And yeah, we just wanted to also say that all of the prepared questions that we sent out were crafted by students currently in the archival program at schools. So, a lot of us are about to graduate and go out and do this kind of work. And we just, these are questions that we really look forward to getting the answers to, and you guys have been wonderful. So we know it's a difficult conversations, but we really appreciate it as fledglings. So thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekend after this.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you all for sticking around.
And thank you all for the great talk today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And if you're fledglings, I'm an old bird.
Have fun.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.